Well, partly because I'm aware of St Andrew's reputation sort of nationally
Yeah.
as a centre of excellence for providing all sorts of interesting and creative care for people with mental health needs, but really because I was an inpatient here myself when I was 17, 1978,
Wow.
79, when I had an episode of clinical depression and a crisis which followed, and I was just fortunate that my mum and dad had health insurance which generously provided for me to come here. So I've been a user of services here in an era when well, it was the late 70s, and I was an inpatient at Isham House in group therapy there, and it saved my life.
Wow.
Literally saved my life. But because of there was a very humane regime there, which I know has been a tradition at this hospital since its very beginning.
Yeah.
You know, Northampton County Asylum sounds like something from a Victorian horror film, but of course asylums were there to provide refuges for people, you know all this. But what was really good for me too is, I mean, one of the reasons why that mental health crisis happened was because I was coming to terms with my sexuality. And as a gay man in Kettering in 1978, there wasn't really much sense of a life rich in possibilities lying dead ahead, I have to say. And it was a much less tolerant world then than it is today. And that was a real struggle, because partly that's an external thing, you know, you're fighting to find your place in the world, but also you internalise that stuff. And that was a huge deal for me. And coming here with an enlightened regime made a big difference to me. And the care I received here, particularly from, well, two psychiatrists in particular, a guy called Colin Wilson, and then another doctor which was called Dr. Lottinger, everyone called her Lottie. But they were just not bothered about me being gay. They just saw
something that was embraced whilst you were here.
Yeah, Colin gave me, I remember him because he was the doctor on the back pages of Cosmo, so he was kind of like glamorous. But he gave me a Geoffrey Weeks book, Coming Out, which was an absolutely seminal work in gay liberation, but also in encouraging, it was addressed mostly to gay men then, I think, G rather than LBT and all the rest of it, into kind of reconciling, integrating that as part of an identity which was just fine, you know, nothing remarkable. And of course that's something which I think lots of people more readily accept and find now. But in those days it was really quite unusual. And that's what saved my life, I think. It just made me realise that all that internalised self-loathing that was the sort of heritage of people who grew up in a world where being gay was a criminal identity, and also made you, you know, in my world, I had an uncle who had been convicted for gross indecency. Basically, he was having sex with someone in a public toilet, which, you know, for lots of gay men of his generation, that was about as good as it got. And so there was this kind of aura of shame and disgrace around that, and that was not spoken about. And then when you realise, and then I was at a boys' public school where any suggestion that you might have any same-sex attraction at all was so threatening and so potentially disruptive of the kind of power relationships in that, that if you realised that that was you, it was like being sentenced. I mean, it was almost, in those days, sort of gay men were held in a sort of contempt, which now I think is, you would most commonly find with people with paedophilia, I think.
Yeah.
It was that extreme and intense. And kind of growing up and realising, oh, that's me, was really tough.
Oh.
Well, it took years,
Yeah.
because the damage that's done to people, as you very well know, if they're kind of constantly reinforcing negative messages on the rest of it, you know, it takes a long time to unpick all that. And also the nature of my relationships. I think I'd formed very kind of passionate but secret relationships with other boys who I had crushes on at school. That's not a great sort of foundation for building mature relationships in later life. But what I got here was a sense that this was an identity which was not necessarily a negative identity, and that there was a battle to be fought about that. And that was really good, because if you can fight a battle, it sort of heals you in a way. Can do, not always. But it just meant that this was, and I just became determined that I wasn't going to submit to that negative assessment, and I wasn't going to live the narrow, mean and constrained life that was the best on offer. And I ran away to London and formed a new life and became an activist. Fortunately, at a time when that was a very live and exciting time. And then through access to media, through pop music, we began to sort of fight that fight on quite a broad front and just caught that rising tide of change. I think lots of people began to realise that that rather prejudiced, narrow view of homosexuality was both unjust and also not real.
Yeah, inaccurate.
Yeah, and then found that lots of other people were having that same experience, and we formed a kind of common purpose and fought that fight.
Yeah.
In the middle of that HIV hit, and that kind of took us into another place.
I was going to say the stigma then associated with the gay community, with
Yeah.
1981 I think was the first case of...
Hit us about 1980. It was a sort of thing we read about in the gay press. There used to there was a gay cancer that you were seeing in kind of East Coast, West Coast United States. But then it kind of hit home because it started affecting people. And then, of course, that gave a lot of energy to people who were still hostile or antipathetic towards accepting LGBT people. So that was a big fight. But also, when your friends start dying around you, you really have to get to deal with that. So then I was involved in a group that started, I think, on the London Lighthouse, which was the first dedicated unit to care of people with HIV and AIDS. But that was a really dark period because half the people we knew died. My first partner died, and that was a common experience. And that was really, really tough too. And you thought, having sort of fought the good fight and I think sort of had some sort of degree of success and felt vindicated by that, to then all of a sudden be dealing with what felt like a medieval plague against which you were unprotected in spite of everything that medical... And I have to say, the medical response was fantastic. Lots of really brilliant, dedicated people who were committed to caring and curing, and it was really fantastic to be part of that. But it took its toll. And I think it was in the middle of that I first started thinking that Christianity, which I'd grown up in, although as a very distant and detached observer, but I was a chorister when I was a kid, so I was sort of, I was going to say infected with it, but I'd had that, and I began to think that I wanted it back because it spoke to those really deep fundamental questions about mortality and identity and about freedom and about liberation. And oddly enough, what I found in Christianity when I embraced it was a parallel narrative to the one I'd found in my coming out, that it was about stepping out of darkness into light, that it was about not accepting a kind of internalized negativity. It was about understanding what it was to be fully human. And so in spite of the church being seen with justification then and indeed now as sort of hostile to equality for LGBT people, actually it gave me more resources and tools to continue to fight the fight. And we're in a very interesting place with that now. I wouldn't pretend for a second that the Church of England or any other church, some churches are actually very good on it, is good on that stuff. It's not, it's really bad. We're fighting a huge fight about it. But I'm full of hope that it will be fine in the end. Well, I think there's going to happen. I mean, one of two things will happen. Either the church retreats into a sort of la of pretending that just the evidence around them, the world is more and more full of evidence that LGBT people are living their lives contentedly, happily, in ways that are full of grace and holiness, if that's how you want to live your life. And to ignore that is just perverse and also irrational. And there comes a point when, and it's interesting, the Church of England at the moment is in a kind of agony about that, because lots of people in senior positions know that very well, that there are lots of gay people, lesbian people, bisexual, trans people, all sorts of people who are living lives that are full of light and truth, if I can put it that way, and love. And yet are obliged to kind of maintain a discipline and a doctrine which doesn't allow that to be true. Well, you can't continue with that, can you? When reality collides with unreality, well, I don't know, Donald Trump's in the White House, isn't he? But you would hope that sooner or later truth will prevail.